Hi, I'm Denise,
And I'm Tom.
and welcome to our podcast, Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
We created our podcast for you, our nonprofit colleagues. As nonprofit professionals with over 50 years of experience combined, we've led nonprofit hospitals, university programs, campaigns that have transformed cities, communities, and campuses. We're from Chicago and Detroit, and now we're in the Pacific Northwest. Our work has taken us across the country from the Midwest to Seattle, to Portland, California, and nationally. We've seen it, lived it, and have learned from it.
We've all been through a lot as nonprofit professionals, and we hear you, we see you, and we understand. We know you, too, are used to wearing many hats. It can be exhausting, but we come together with the shared mission to transform the world. Because We've Been in Your Shoes is a podcast for you, us, and our entire nonprofit community, sharing and learning from one another so we can continue to innovate and unleash capacity for good. We'll hear from colleagues and peers, discuss emerging issues in the sector, and provide you with key takeaways and useful tips to support you in all you do. We believe that people and philanthropy equal possibilities. Join us on the Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast with new topics and special guests. Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm excited for today. We have a special guest.
I'm looking forward to talking to our special guest today, Nancy.
Yeah, Nancy, she is a leader in the nonprofit space, particularly in education. And we're going to do a little deep dive in learning more about equity in education, as well as her experience in the nonprofit space. So before we invite Nancy in, let me share a little bit about her background. Nancy is a self-described learner of all things. She's an educator and over the past 25 years has worked in both public and private schools and loves working with youth. Equity has been at the core of her work in schools, beginning with her first teaching job in California Public Schools Academy program, which served underserved populations. Her work centers equity in restorative justice practices and nonviolent communication. Nancy identifies as an Indigenous Latinx woman. Nancy earned a BA from Carleton College and her master's in education from Harvard University and is a trained equity and inclusion facilitator. Wow, Nancy, thank you for joining us. There's so much that I know our audience was going to learn from you and the breadth of background and experience you have. I know that from teachers all the way to administrators in school systems, this is definitely a focus area. How do you bring equity into the classroom, and how do you also support students and other colleagues as we're still weathering a pandemic? So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That's right. Nancy, Dinez gave a great overview of your background, but tell me, what are some of the things that you want our audience to know that maybe was not included in that background?
Well, I am so excited to be here and to chat with you about all the things that you have on your minds and on probably mine too. Something that I would share is that I have really gotten into darning lately. Darning, like as in darning socks and sweaters and things. I find it really meditative. And I know that that is
I love that.
something that, we'll probably talk about as far as, how are we doing in the pandemic and stuff. But it is something that I picked up right around when the pandemic started. And because some moths ate through some of my favorite sweaters. And I was like, well, I'm not throwing them out. So that's something to share. And then also that, I've been an educator for 25 years or more now, I guess more. And it just continues to be just a wonderful source of energy.
Wow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Nancy, share with us, how do you define DEI?
Okay, big question, Tom. Let's see. I think from my perspective, it's a changing, moving, living definition that is it reflects what's happening in our society and how we would like to move. But I think at the core of it, we're really from my perspective of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's really about creating a society where every person is seen and heard, valued, and everyone can be offered dignity in the place where they are. and so that everyone across the globe, across our country, and we live in a place where things are I'll use the throwback word of segregated, and it's a very interesting time right now.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question leading up to that. And, I'd love to get back to your background. But before we get back to your background, I know something that, I've been reading is maybe our audience might really appreciate hearing. What is the difference when we talk about equality in education and in the classroom versus equity in the education and classroom? What are the differences between having an equitable and an equal environment for our students? Could you explain that?
Yeah, it really has to do with access. Does every child have access to positive learning in the classroom and in their school experience? And that may be, the consideration may come from a child who is in a predominantly white school, who comes from a predominantly Latino neighborhood or Black neighborhood. What does that access look like for that child? And are we, is the history being inclusive? Is that, like I said previously, there's something that dignifies the existence of people when you talk about the history of that population, when children can learn about themselves in a broader environment like school. And so, there's that. And then there's access based on learning differences, based on physical differences. And so there's a lot there, but it's the access piece that we're really talking about.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And let's just kind of pedal backwards a little bit and ask you about your journey. How did you end up in the nonprofit space and as a leader in education and facilitating DEI? Can you share with us how your journey brought you to where you are today?
Sure. Though I don't know that it's a very convoluted journey. I don't know that I can give you a linear timeline. But in education, you find your way to different things, and you meet people, and you kind of, you know, you, you evolve as an educator, and you find things that really power your work. And I do view the work of being an educator as a spiritual work that we do, because you really have to connect to this broader love of humanity.
I love that.
And children, yeah, thank you. Children are really where it's at, all the way up through our adolescence. Boy, those, our adolescents they're just craving love and that acceptance and all of that. And so, for me, it came from that, really, from understanding that was such a broad need, that movement for me was, well, how do I what is missing? What do we need? What do our children need? What do our adolescents need? And I am my training is really in adolescent work, and so I've focused most of my work in that area. And so for me, it was really about finding what the needs, where the gaps were, and what children, or rather adolescents, needed, and how could I be a better prepared adult to serve what their needs were in the classroom, and then as an administrator. So I worked in Montessori schools. I've worked in private schools and public schools and high schools and middle schools, and made my way through a few different situations and became an administrator at a Montessori school, and really was able to. It was a program that was not so huge that we couldn't, do stuff, right? And not so small that we couldn't do stuff. It was a great size. And so we had a lot of, we were nimble in a lot of ways that we maybe would not have been had we been in a larger environment. It just called to us to start to play with the curriculum, make shifts in ways that were meaningful, around what content we were offering our students, what opportunities we were offering them to be active in their communities, how we were seeing them, and how we were allowing them to show up in an environment that was is traditionally difficult, right? School, who loves middle school, right? That was the goal, right? The goal was, how do we maybe not love it, maybe they won't love it, but maybe they will want to be there. And I'll tell you what, our kids were, they wanted to come to school. They, even before the pandemic started, right?
Yeah.
They wanted to come. They didn't want to miss school. We had parents calling in saying, "Oh, so and so's got a fever, but they really want to come in," and I'd have to say, "No, they can't come in if they have a fever." So we saw this vibrancy
Yeah.
as we began to respond to what their needs were.
Okay, so Nancy, we had a conversation a while back about equity and equality, and it's not one versus the other. But one of the things you said, and it stayed with me, it's about listening to the voices of the people we're trying to serve. It's about understanding how to communicate and address their needs and figure out what their needs are. And we need to figure out what those gaps are. Can you talk a little bit about that? I remember the statement you made, and it made a lot of sense to me. It was wonderful. But can you talk a little bit about what I just shared back with you?
Sure. We tend to, in life, we tend to want to fix things or try to figure out how to make things right. When we work in the nonprofit world and maybe government agencies, that we try to come in and do the right thing, and that's it's a heartfelt move. And I would say that I think what I was getting at there was we want to be sure that our movements are in line with what communities want. And the only way to find out what communities want and need is to ask them, to go to the community and start to dig in. And it's a long process, but it's well worth the time invested if we can get to a place where whatever we're doing as a nonprofit or whatever we're doing as a government, to serve whatever population we're trying to serve, if that comes from a joint community effort.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And with that in mind,
Yeah,
in this role, have you made mistakes in trying to understand the needs of people?
all the time, all the time.
I love that honesty. Thank you.
It's
It's
just
hard to admit. People don't wanna admit that. Yeah.
ugh, it's hard not to make mistakes too. We just, it just happens because we want to do things at a faster pace, or we want to make big change, or we just don't know what we don't know, right? And so that's part of what part of that, solving that. And we may never solve that, mistakes will continue to happen, but part of solving that is getting a broad band of voices involved in problem solving, or in troubleshooting, or in creating something new. And we'll continue to make mistakes, that will just continue to happen. But if we can own those mistakes, learn
Mhm.
from them, and say, what okay, how do we fix this, or how do we make it right, then we have a better shot at serving our communities and helping problems rather than creating more.
Hmm.
So, Nancy, just from your perspective and the work that you're doing now, what are you seeing as kind of the trends or the pressing issues, particularly as we're, I guess, walking or moving slowly out of the pandemic in terms of mask mandates
Mhm.
and lockdown? What are some of the trends or issues that you see rising up, particularly in education environments?
Definitely mental health struggles, both for adults and for students.
Mhm.
I think that is broadly, it's not just in the education world, but it's pretty stark. And I would say that's the biggest one. And then the other part is just the displacement of, just not being in school the way that we would have expected. And that's hard for parents too, that their children are not in school the way that they would have expected. And it's a shift. It's a shift for everybody. But the mental health piece is very, it's pronounced.
And have you seen issues rise with kids lagging in their academic milestones? Have you seen that particularly at either an early education space or in middle and high school? Are you seeing significant lags, or is that unique, you think, to the environment, the school, and the community that supports that?
Yeah, I haven't been in the classroom this year, or in the past year and a half, so
Okay.
it's hard for me to speak directly to it. I have heard from different administrators and teachers that that is an issue that has come up. That because the expectations had to be shifted during the beginning part of the pandemic, it's tricky to, well, first of all, kids weren't going to school for a while, right, at all, and then it was online,
Yes.
and then now they were partial in school, and now they're back in school masked. And so, I think there have been a number of shifts that have required teachers and students to figure out what the expectations are of them, and for teachers, what are sane expectations to have of students.
Yeah, I can see how that also contributes to, as you bring up the most pressing issues around mental health and our well-being, and particularly for students and their families and the teacher. That environment is, it's
Mhm.
key for, that being recognized and acknowledged, because disruption in routine, especially in learning, can really alter, a lot of aspects of a child's learning experience and environment. So thank you for sharing that and lifting up the mental health. I
Absolutely.
know, Tom, you want to talk about that, but that's something that we, as our podcast, we want to center and bring recognition to, and we don't do enough to talk about it, to help also break the stigma that our
Agreed.
mental health and well-being is key.
It is key. Before we go there, I do want to ask Nancy one more question about your leadership, Nancy. And you are a women leader in the nonprofit world. You have your consultant business. You've had other businesses and so forth. What would you recommend? What would you say to your younger self? What could you say to younger women or women that are getting into the field? What advice would you give?
Ooh,
Great question, I think. Thank you for asking that, Tom. I'll say that for you, Nancy. I appreciate you saying that, Tom.
yeah, thank you. What advice would I give my younger self? I think it would just, you know, I've been doing a lot of reading about the mind gut connection, and I would tell myself to trust my gut. And what I would tell myself even more than that is to bring my voice out more.
Mm,
There were years when I was figuring things out still, and I was just a quieter version of myself, which was fine. It worked for me, but I don't think that I got to ask all the questions that I wanted to ask at that time, right? And so I wish that I had more confidence in that.
Do you think that the climate that we all are in, as a woman myself, I think one of the things is, at this stage of my career, I'm just learning to be bold. What does it look like to be bold and standing up
mm,
for yourself and other women? Because, gender equity has been a challenge in all aspects of the nonprofit space. Also, while a lot of women tend to be in the teaching profession and in the classroom, oftentimes administrative leadership is not. And that goes, I think, across the entire nonprofit space, which includes universities and health systems. I think that is a challenge we're experiencing still. And, our generation, Nancy, I think how do we, you know, be bold while making and driving change to happen, but recognizing that oftentimes you can feel alone in that process. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's something that I think about, is we're challenged, I think, as a gender group in the nonprofit space, actually in all areas of life, but particularly in our profession, and in our sector, when we're 75% of the workforce is mostly identify as women and female, we have less than 25% of the decision making roles, heads of major organizations, institutions. And so, I think of all things that are unique to women in the workplace, parental leave, various other resources, access to services, since so many women are at the head of the classroom, but not necessarily making decisions, oftentimes in those positions as administrators and superintendents, they're not as represented in those positions. How do you see that impacting the sector in terms of gender equity?
Yeah, I think that's a big one, right?
Yeah,
It's the same for people of color. We don't have a lot of people of color administrators at
that's true.
at a lot of the um, public school superintendent levels, um, in private school leadership roles, and so there's a
Hmm.
similar gap there. So I would say, yeah, it definitely impacts how we, as women and as people of color, view ourselves and how we view the power dynamic, whether or not we're aware of it, how we view that power dynamic impacting us in our work. And there's a study, and I don't know what the numbers are exactly, and I can look it up and send it to you when I find it. But there is a study that has been done for children that shows that children, and I want to say this was a study that included Black children, but children who have a teacher, one teacher for 1 year, if let's say that the child is a Black child and they have a teacher that is Black, that those children in that situation have an elevated graduation rate, just having 1 year of a role model of somebody that looks like you. And that's not to say that, like, that is the same for adults. I don't know if that study has ever been done for adults, but I remember reading that and thinking how powerful to know that
Wow.
just one year of being a teacher with a child that looks like you, if you're a person of color, um, will impact that child in that way
Hmm.
potentially.
Hmm.
Yeah. I don't remember all the details about it, and it was so long ago that I read it while I was still a teacher, I think. So that it stayed with me. It was something that stayed with me, with as far as just thinking about the work and really the importance of having teachers of color in the workforce and in administrative roles.
That's incredible.
And so let me circle back to when you just said that, Nancy, but also circling back to uh, what women experience in
Yeah.
all walks of life, especially in the professional world. What would you say to a person, a young woman that would like to get into the field, or coming out of college and they
Hmm.
want to get their career started? What would both of you say or recommend to these women? And one of the things I always say is, uh, Dinesh knows this about me. Yes, saying yes to adventure, taking a chance, taking a risk. That is something that's inspired me for years. But tell me, from both your experience, what would you recommend to young women or to women in general that want to get into this world or someplace else? And Dinesh, I'll start with you.
Oh, with me. Okay. Um, Nancy, you have a little bit more time to think. I do love your yes to adventure. For a younger, maybe younger version of myself, I'd like to think of myself and talk to myself when I was 25. But for anyone really looking in the nonprofit space, particularly a woman, that is looking at this as a place for them to bring about social change, to help continue to transform the world, do better, and do good through that work. I would just really emphasize it's hard work. You're gonna have roadblocks, you're gonna have really a lot of people who doubt your ability, and connect to your capabilities of being able to do that. So when I first came on to the nonprofit space, I will tell you, my family, they're like, "Denise, you gotta stop trying to save the world. You can't do it. You cannot affect change." And when you walk into this space, you will hear that. I don't think it has changed 25 years ago to what I'm doing today. I still, believe that I can affect change. So, what I would say to that younger woman in particular, we recognize sexual harassment, gender biases, gender inequities exist in our environment. And so the goal is to really align yourself with other women, find a great mentor, create opportunities to connect with as many people as you can, to have allies on your side, and also look at your own conviction and ability to do the work. And anything you do affects change, contributes to our social impact. And I would just stay focused on where your heart is and where your passion is. And there's going to be some hard times. You're going to question your ability. Why am I in this space? And why do we get less pay than our male counterparts? And then why do we get less pay than people in the corporate and for-profit entities? Those are challenges. I'm, optimistic that some of that pay equity will hopefully go in a better direction in the next few years. But I would definitely really encourage that young woman to join the nonprofit space, to recognize you as one individual can affect positive change. So that's kind of how I would talk to her.
Thank you. Yeah. Nancy.
Wow, that's great. Yes, I agree with what Dinez said. And I think, I have thought about this because I was recently on a panel talking to young teachers. And I think, what I would say is look for your allies. This is what I recommended. Look for allies. It's one of the best sources of strength is to find um, people who share some of your ideals as far as what you're here to do. And I'm thinking of in the ed world, in the education world. And what I think it's really about finding the allyship, and, the mentorship is so important, so important. So keep your eyes open for mentors. And, I just would add that for experienced people, I would say for experienced people, I think there's the same call, right? But on the other side of it, which is go mentor people.
Mm,
Make sure that your eyes are open and that you're looking for those young people who are looking for mentors.
mm, mm.
That's our job. We've got to usher in the next group of people, and our bandwidth may be light, but it's got to be there.
Yeah.
We have to do it. Yep.
No, that's really a good question. So I would love to just kind of dive into some kind of fun parts of, because we've been in your shoes, uh, really recognizing, as Nancy said, not so much our age, but our experience in really helping shape opportunities we see, as well as being able to be more bold in our direction, lifting up our experience in the field and just amongst
Yes.
us. And I know that other people would love, because we've been in your shoes, just to kind of share. I would love to ask both of you, start with Nancy. What's the one thing that makes you wake up and want to do this work? Because we know it's hard work. What makes you get up and want to do this every day?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I always fall back on the reason I do this work. I didn't start doing it for this reason, but the reason I continue to do this work and do it in the way that I do it is because I have 3 kids, and two of them are young adults now, and one of them is in high school. And I see their movement through the world and how things continue to affect them in ways that are not always positive. And it's a hard, as a parent, it's hard, to see that. And so I think it's one of those things that I continue to do because of the young people, right? Because of children like mine, or like the kid that I was just growing up, and understanding that there is a need for a shift, a societal shift. And again, it's, a societal shift where across the board we hold everyone with dignity, and everyone feels the dignity when they get up in the morning and walk out.
Mm. Well said.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. Now it's your turn, Tom.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm not a parent, but several years ago, before the pandemic, I was in New York. I was taking, what do you call it? Uber.
Uber.
And I was just having for some reason, I've been calling these Ubers Zoomers now. I'm not sure why.
I love that.
I
That's,
love it. Zoomers.
that's
I
going to be
love
the
it.
name of my next company, and it's going to be like a taxi company.
Right? Zoomers.
Zoom.
Zoomers.
Zoomers.
I was having a conversation with this gentleman, and he was talking about why he does what he do. Why was he driving an Uber? Older guy, and he says it's about his kids. And I said to him, "Wow, parents make the ultimate sacrifice for their kids." And he turned around, looked at me. He goes, "You know what? I don't think that's what your parent would have thought about you, or what I think about my kids. And I don't think parents think that way. This is an investment into our kids. It's an investment into our communities, our society, and the future." That changed my whole
Your Uber
perspective.
driver said
Yes,
that?
yes.
We
It
yeah.
totally changed my perspective.
I think we need
Yes.
a segment in the from the back seat of the Uber, like, what is it called? What, reflections, or yeah, something.
Oh,
I
something like, but it blew my mind, and
love it.
we continued our conversation. But I came to realize that what we do is an investment in our communities, our society, our future. And that is the work we're doing in our nonprofits, the work we're doing in our schools, the work you're doing with your kids. It is an investment, and it's about the future, and it's about our current societies. And it something reinforced that with me when I was reading an article about everything that's going on right now. And they said, the article went on to say, because of what our kids are going through right now, they're going to be the ones that make the change for the future. That gave me a lot of hope, and we see that right now, even with a lot of the kids who are thinking about social justice. If you pay attention to the kids that are going to college right now, there's a high percentage of kids that are talking about social justice because of the stuff they've experienced. So it is an investment in what we're doing and how we're doing, and so forth. And that's what I truly believe in. And that's the reason why I do what I do, is because it is an investment. Knowing that I may not be able to affect someone today, but the work I'm doing will affect how our young people are moving into this world and how they're changing the world. That's why I do what I
Oh,
do.
that's fantastic. I think that's really, you know, the nonprofit space, it's hard work. We
Yep.
recognize,
Yep.
if you're listening and you're, working in the space, you're doing the heavy lifting. Whatever your organization's mission is, you embody that, you live it. And, when we all go home at night, we bring that work home with us, our thoughts, our experiences, our conversations with community members and colleagues. And so
Mhm.
being able to also build a community of support so we can all come together and talk about those challenges, how to solve together some of the problems our world
Mhm.
faces. The more that we have these types of conversations and really understanding how people end up in this space, what makes them wake up every day to do this work. I think it sparks ideas, opportunities, creative thinking around why the nonprofit space is appealing to so many younger people who are looking for organizations that are
Mhm.
social impact, social justice oriented, because they want to see change happen today. And that change allows everybody to kind of move up together. And, it is challenging to I've been a part of organizations where you maybe chart out a goal to X, Y, and Z affect, these outcomes. And sometimes you can't get everything. But I think you need to also kind of lean into what you were able to get to. Even those smaller milestones are worthwhile celebrating, because the more you build up, you can reach those bigger outcomes. And, I don't want people to, and why I do it is, I don't want I just
Yeah.
want a better world, maybe for my kids, but I wanna be a part of leaving the world better than what I found it, and I think that's what the calling has been for me, and then the fact that I learn when I engage with so many
Yeah.
different, people,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, just kinda adding on to what both of you shared, that was
Mhm.
so moving.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other final tips and takeaways? I think what I heard from Nancy is really, centering, also equity in the classroom, really bringing investment as well as a commitment to this work by not just showing up as an administrator, an adult, and a leader in the classroom, but being there for your students. Those are some really key takeaways,
Hmm.
and also just kind of hearing you speak to the why you get up and do this was really moving, because it is important to think about how you as an individual can affect change for a younger person and a child. And that can really shape their future. So that's my
Mhm.
takeaway from what you shared with us. I love it. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing and spending time with us, really.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Mhm.
We'll
Yep.
have to do it again.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
Join us next time as we share, advocate, and highlight experiences and ideals from nonprofit colleagues, leaders, and champions.
Subscribe to Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast and be the first to hear our new episodes introducing new topics and guest speakers. Remember, nonprofit friends, you're not alone because we've been in your shoes.